Thank you, Deborah and Megan, for so efficiently reorganizing this to make it a two-day conference. I think it's actually really, really nice that we have a bit more space to discuss the papers. I guess my talk and perhaps this panel overall is a bit different in that it focuses on more legalistic things or more specific things rather than kind of the broad advice issues that we've had before, but I think they link nicely. I'm sorry for not submitting a paper. That's because I'm submitting a book manuscript today, and that kind of had priority. So sorry about that. I'll start with this fieldwork story that happened in spring of last year. I was doing fieldwork in network meetings of asylum advice givers in Switzerland. There are about 42 different organizations that provide asylum advice, legal aid, legal representations, and they kind of meet every 5 to 6 weeks to share information on cases, on legal developments, etc. And in spring of last year, Andrea, who is both a guardian and legal representative of unaccompanied minors in one of the Swiss cantons, came to the meeting and said, I have a case that I would like to discuss. What she told us was that she lost her case or lost her appeal because she missed the deadline, because she didn't know what the actual deadline was and submitted the appeal too late. Now, Andrea is a lawyer who is employed by the state, and she's both the legal representative and the legal guardian, and she didn't know the deadline of the appeals for the asylum appeal. She'd done this job for almost 10 years. She'd always thought she knew the deadline, but she didn't. As we discussed this case, it became clear that everybody else was unsure about the deadline too. And it took us 30 minutes to figure out what the actual deadline was, because everybody had a different idea, a different feeling of what the correct deadline would be. So asylum law is an immensely complex part of the law. It has, in Switzerland, its own procedural rules, so it is different from normal procedural rules. And as this example shows, the people involved in providing advice and legal representation struggle with knowledge about the asylum law and the legal system. So this, and many cases like this for me, are indicative of the question of what is quality advice, and how far can or are advisors providing quality advice. Sorry, moving this down so I can actually see. And one of the key issues seems to be connected to knowledge, right? And while they sorted it in the end, it became apparent that everybody was struggling with these even basic procedural rules, like when to submit an appeal if you're representing an accompanied minor. And this applied to both volunteers without a law degree, as with lawyers who had a law degree and kind of done the legal training that is required to be a formal lawyer and accepted to the bar in Switzerland. So it's not even, or what I find was not even a problem with volunteers versus professionals, but a struggle with knowledge and a struggle with giving sound advice in general. And there are many of these cases like Andreas. There is Kim, who I sat with during a kind of online advice that she does, where she rejected a case on the basis that she didn't believe the thing, which was a humanitarian visa, the person wanted to apply for existed, even though it clearly exists in law. And when I talked to her about that it exists in law, she said, yeah, but it's not a thing. It is related to things that I also saw in fieldwork in Germany earlier, when there were regularization campaigns by the state, but advisors said, no, don't participate in these because you can't trust the state. So the question of sound advice is, for me, was one of the key things that I encountered during fieldwork. And yet it was something that was never openly talked about. So similarly to Francisco and the question of deservingness, the question of quality advice was never mentioned. Everybody seemed to struggle, but no one seemed to raise the issue. Instead, there was kind of a presumption that everybody was doing good work, that everybody was delivering the advice that was appropriate. It was not seen as a problem. As I continued doing my fieldwork, I encountered not discussions, but something like rumors that quality might be an issue. There were offhand comments about others that weren't so firm on the law, about others who were quite selective in applying the law. But there was always the idea that they themselves were providing sound advice. And that kind of culminated in what I'll try to call a spy story, which was at a Christmas party of the kind of key umbrella organization, the Swiss Refugee Council, where during the Christmas party I was asked to join the smokers outside, even though I don't smoke. And in the corner of the smokers area, people started talking to me about what I thought about quality standards. And from this conversation, this very private conversation, there started to be a kind of quality project, or a start of a quality project, where people would write to me not from their office email but from their private email, where we would meet at the university and people would take care to enter through the back alley door of the university so as not to be seen by other people they would see. So we could discuss the question of quality and how to ensure quality in these advice settings. And at some point, when we kind of had figured out a way to discuss this, or maybe to bring in more people and make this a more formal discussion, the conversation went away. And there are people who have kind of completely fieldwork ghosted me and have never talked to me again. So quality is really a weird issue in that sense, because it's clearly an issue and clearly also something that is almost a taboo, almost something that can't be talked about, or if so, only in kind of shadowy ways. And I think there's two solutions, or two reasons to that I want to bring up. One of them is something I've written about before, and that's politics. I think quality advice is half knowledge and half your political position, because the question of good advice is related to the question of how your political stance is. So if you say don't apply because you can't trust the state, it's a completely different issue to helping people apply. Similarly, we have cases where indeed organizations have been extremely selective in which cases to take on and represent, where they said, oh, they have no chances anyway, so we're not going to bother trying, we're not going to help them in their appeals anyway. So both in terms of positive and negative relations to the state, and in terms of being selective in terms of only taking the worthwhile cases, and indeed this is again related to questions of deservingness or of likelihood of succeeding in this case, there are different criteria that factor. And there was a huge divide among the advisors in how to see these issues. And indeed, this tension of seeing advice as something that is subversive and against the state, or seeing advice and being funded by the state as something that is complicity with the asylum system, was something that people discussed. And in the migration context, we talk about what we call a migration industry within the migration regime, which means that there are organizations that also have their own interest in providing advice or providing services for migrants. And it's, I guess, something that Anna has written about a lot. So, for example, I encountered in early 2015, when I was doing fieldwork in Germany, a large NGO that hadn't done migrant advice before, that had bid for a contract to provide refugee advice, and gotten a large sum of money from the state, and then decided to specialize, because clearly they couldn't help everybody, on people who were already accepted refugees and to help them in their family reunification cases, which they have an entitlement to. So they were helping those who already had asylum with cases that they already had a right to anyway. And when, with a legal change in 2016, that became more complicated. They changed from family reunification advice to integration advice, where they would help people find the right language course. So they got this advice contract, but were extremely selective in how they would apply that. So the question of quality of advice is not only of giving sound advice in the question of knowledge, but it's also a question of what do you do with the money that you get, and who's worthy of advice, and kind of where's your threshold of giving good advice. The other part of why quality is an issue but not talked about is that a lot of people are afraid of measurements and afraid of what they call a race to the bottom, or what we also in academia call a race to the bottom, where they say if there's quality standards, this is the minimum criteria that everybody now meets, and going beyond that is no longer useful. They're afraid of quality standards because they might say that might mean certification and we might not be able to afford certification. So we're excluded from providing advice. So there's issue of political tensions within the community, but there's also fears about kind of what quality talk means in terms of managerialism and in terms of how they can do their job, or what they see as their job. So there was a moment where quality was talked about and almost kind of an idea of bringing that to the fore, but it never happened. What happens now? There is a change in the funding scheme. It's the opposite of austerity. The Swiss government has decided that everybody who applies for asylum gets legal advice and legal representation if needed. But this is going to be delivered in 9 different centers all over Switzerland. So from 42 organizations, there are only going to be 9 big contracts. So there's a kind of narrowing of contracts and increase in competition. And a huge divide again in this, or tension in this community of who's going to compete with whom, who's going to join together. And 2 things are happening. The bidding ends in September. 2 things are happening right now. One, colleagues of me in Bern are setting up a certification system for legal advisors, which is a certificate for advanced studies, and it costs about £25,000 to complete. 2, the Red Cross, one of the big corporate NGOs in Switzerland, is partnering up with PricewaterhouseCoopers in their bid to win the test center advice contracts. Because in these centers there will be free advice and representation, other NGOs providing advice will not get access to the refugees or asylum seekers. So there are clear issues, and it seems that not talking about the quality standards has set in motion issues of quality and efficiency that indeed excludes our organizations, and that forgets issues of securing quality that I think are already in place. Because if we remember the first story that I told you of Andrea, she didn't know and she lost the case, but they figured it out together. And this figuring it out together, and one person bringing in the case and everybody realizing, oh no, I actually also don't know this, is a really valuable source. Because, as I said, asylum law is so complex that it helps to collaborate and bring your experiences together, and that's what's probably missing in this kind of competitive framework where NGOs now work with outside organizations. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.